How much?
How much you gotta spend?
Frank, this is more than a month's salary.
Out here, it is all about our hustle.
Do you really have to take us to the station?
We're everywhere. We have been everywhere for a really long time.
Yes, work! Yes, work! Yes, work! Yes, work! No bad horse! No bad horse! Just that boss!
So I'm so excited to introduce this two-part series on prostitution in colonial Nigeria. Now, we're wrapping up the year, and I want to make a future promise to listeners that we are going to be talking about non-Western conceptions of prostitution. We're making more of an effort to do that next year, but we're going to start by talking about the incredible scholarly work and research that was done by Saheed Aderinto in her work, which I recommend for any listeners that want more information on this topic. Her book is When Sex Threatened the State, Illicit Sexuality, Nationalism and Politics in Colonial Nigeria, 1900 to 1958. So the first figure we're going to be discussing is the celebrated sex worker, Segilola Eleyinju Ege. Now, I'm going to begin by quoting directly from Saheed Aderinto's book, When Sex Threatened the State, Illicit Sexuality, Nationalism and Politics in Colonial Nigeria, 1900 and 1958. She states, one of the most detailed written sources about the life and times of a Lagos prostitute is the autobiography of Segilola entitled The Life History of Me, Segilola, endowed with fascinating eyes, the sweetheart of 1,001 men. Initially serialized into 30 chapters in the Lagos Herald, a leading bilingual newspaper published between 1929 and 1930, published as the first Yoruba novel and later translated into English. This autobiography tells the story of a popular Lagos prostitute and her clientele, which cuts across ethnicity, social class, nationality, and race. Now, let's pull back a little bit and talk about the context into which Segilola was born into. Now, it was the transatlantic slave trade that made Lagos an international hub and an urban center. And this was also the pretext that British colonialists used to invade it. So in 1851, the British, frustrated by their inability to stop the transatlantic slave trade, which had just recently begun to embarrass them, decided to invade Lagos using a small rift in politics as the pretext and coming in to end the transatlantic slave trade. So the immediate impacts, so it took a decade for them to take over the city, but it becomes the first site of British colonialism in Africa. So it was the transatlantic slave trade that made Lagos into a city, and it's also the original sin that the British used as a pretext for coming in to ostensibly end the transatlantic slave trade, and that happens in 1951. Now, the immediate impact of colonialism is an increase in population and a decrease in the transatlantic slave trade from Lagos. So the initial, I guess you would call it refugees, coming into Lagos are freed slaves who are running to a safe harbor. So Segilola, so she's born into a good family, a good Yoruba family in 1982, in September of 1882. She is born one of 6 children, but she is the only surviving child. So she becomes an only child, and her father dies before her first birthday, leaving her alone with her mother. Economically, during this period, you see a rise in economic activity of women as they replace the male patriarchs as the colonial economy sort of shifts and changes the power dynamics involved. So one of the first things that happens is the introduction of infrastructure, colonial militarization, which of course is like a huge bachelor population. The cash economy starts to begin driving up bride prices, and the cash economy also like reduces the immediate buying power of like more traditional patriarchs in other parts of the country. You see a huge rise in demand for prostitutes who begin, even at the lowest levels, are making 3 and 4 times what the stated minimum wage is for like an average day laborer in the city. So you see women who are able to take on the traditionally patriarchal role of paying off family debts, paying to take care of children and elderly parents, paying their own way. This is an existential threat to male control, whether it's local patriarchal African control or male control through the colonizers. You know, misogyny all around. The other thing to remember about Lagos and the increase in immigration, the increase in, it's effectively a military base, which is a very important like mechanism of colonial control. And it's also a port town. Now, the two things that colonialists care the most about are, of course, the military, which is the source of their power, and merchants or trade, which is the source of their wealth, which they then use to pay the military. And it's all sort of like a clusterfuck circle that leads to like nobody wins there. But that's the circle of life if you're a colonialist, is a military to control the means of production and the means of production to pay your military in a big circle. So both of those are male-dominated, bachelor-dominated, right? So sea merchants are not bringing their wives on these long journeys. So anyone coming into this port town is looking for usually the company of a local prostitute. And also military and a lot of colonial positions were dependent, in order to even get hired, were dependent on bachelor status. It's another way of increasing the demand for local sex work. Now, the military historically has taken a regulation and toleration perspective on prostitution. And it's not actually until World War II that they start to crack down on prostitution using venereal disease as this like existential threat to the fighting and the win the war efforts. But we can get into that later. So prostitution is not a priority for criminals, is not a priority to the colonialists. It's only a priority to elite Lagosian women who are hoping to crack down on prostitution because they want to, because they believe that it is a threat to African womanhood, that it is a disgrace, and that it threatens their elite civilized status. And you see this similarly with moralists today, because nothing changes and life is a circle. So it's in the early 19th century, 1920s, it's actually feminist Lagosian women who are hoping to direct colonial attention to giving more access to education for women, more economic opportunities for women in order to prevent the scourge of prostitution, which is conflated with like criminality and disease and sort of like an erosion of, all sorts of control, as lower class Lagosians and upper class Lagosians begin to compete for public space, like bars and hotels and places. It feels like prostitution and this rise of unattached men, of the lower classes, the rank and file of the military, rank and file seafarers, are infecting and encroaching a public space that elite Lagosians thought of as their own. So these elite women sort of begin a campaign to crack down on prostitution, ostensibly to help African women and also to like reclaim and moralize the space that they perceive to be losing. But we'll get more into that in episode 2. I can give you an example today. I think that like looking at the history of feminism, especially white feminism, with the criminalization of prostitution, black and white thinking around the exploitation of women and pornography and the sex trade as being synonymous with the exploitation of women in the larger world, and suggesting that the best way to help women out of an exploitative situation is to criminalize them. So this is a tale as old as time. Colonial Nigeria is no exception to this narrative. Segilola is born. She one of 6 children. She becomes the only child of a single mother. Early in her life, she decides to seduce an herbalist that she seeks out in order to help her make a love potion in order to seduce men. Now, apparently the potion works, or she's just a genius at PR because she becomes this celebrated beauty, this celebrated herbalist, this celebrated seducer of men who uses both her physical beauty and also her earned knowledge of traditional African medicine in order to become the lover of what she describes as 1,001 men. Now, her initial life is sort of serialized in this very popular newspaper at the time, and she's publishing this between 1929 and 1930, and then those essays, or those serial essays, are later combined into a novel. It becomes the first Yoruba novel. It is translated into English within her lifetime, and she is this celebrated figure that most people recognize as being like a genuine autobiography. Segilola makes an interesting literary choice in that she, in all of her diverse lovers and diverse travels and she talks about her sexual exploits, but she chooses not to go into a lot of detail. This is not smut. This is not pornography. She does not dwell on what she actually does with her clients. She simply alludes to the sweet lovemaking that she makes with this diverse group of clients, from Europeans to prominent Africans, and across racial and nationalities. But we use her life as a window into what prostitution looks like during this period. And she's writing, and more importantly, publishing during sort of an important transition where you have Lagos as this increasingly international city. You have a booming publishing industry, and it's before the crackdown, increasing criminalization, sexual hysteria, and prohibition of sex work, and then the censorious efforts after that. Had she been publishing a decade later, she would have been censored. But she publishes in 1929, where the only people that seem to be calling for the end of the prohibition of prostitution are the elite Nigerian women who don't have enough social or political capital to make that happen. I think it's important to pause and take a step back and talk about the symbolic significance of Segilola seducing an herbalist and in some ways deriving her power of seduction from this presumably ancient African medicine, and talk about the role of these medicinal herbalists and practitioners of sort of magic, and the role that they played in pre-colonial Nigeria and their increasing demonization within colonial Nigeria. Now, the herbalists who were offering their sort of magical medicine represent a threat to colonial rule, Western medicine, and also elite African doctors who are trained in Western medicine and are competing with European doctors for promotions and elite status. And I know that we've done an episode on the role of witches in Europe and the demonization of people who were offering herbal medicine in defiance of more official and therefore controlled avenues in medicalization. So these are those folks, right? So the religions are different. Presumably the herbal recipes are different, but the social role is the same. And as colonialists cooperate with elite Lagosian doctors, as colonialists cooperate with, Western trained Lagosi doctors to criminalize and demonize this, sort of informal economy of local healers that are widely available to Nigerians of all social classes. And so it's prostitutes and herbalists sort of both coexist in this strange place of helping people, connecting with people, and providing a service that's very much in demand that their community wants, that are being demonized by folks that are hoping to create an artificial monopoly on the art of pleasure, the art of healing, and want to divide us from each other. So one of the dynamics that I think is interesting to dwell upon in colonial Nigeria and colonial everywhere is the absurd and irrational pathologizing of indigenous bodies. So, for example, during this period, now we're talking about like the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, the language around venereal disease is characterized as like a uniquely African epidemic in absolute defiance of everything that anyone knows, right? We're talking about years after the Contagious Diseases Acts in Britain. We're talking about this is a contemporary law of the American Plan in the United States of America. These are terrible laws, and you should go back and listen to the Harriet Hicks episode if you haven't already about the impact of these laws of like criminalizing female bodies in an effort to control venereal disease. But it's interesting the way that doctors, colonialists, propagandists, newspaper articles all sort of like co-conspire to frame venereal disease as like a uniquely African problem. Some theorists blame the heat, for example, as like one of the reasons that people are more sexual in this part of the world. People frame uncontrolled sexuality. They blame aphrodisiacs being sold by these herbalists. They blame the savagery of the African mind. They blame it, and all of it is used to justify the paternalism of the colonial state. It's just this condescension and sort of like blaming the failures of the state on the individual pathologized choices of this supposedly like ungovernable race that's presenting a threat and needs to be thwarted or needs to be controlled or needs to be subdued in some way by the superior European mind that is also suffering from a venereal epidemic in the homeland, but like they just don't talk. It's like this willful, I mean, it's gaslighting is what it is. It's like that's the word for it. The willful gaslighting of the African population by colonizers. We talked about the pathologizing of African bodies. We talked about specifically that colonialists tend to care about two groups of people more than any other, the military and the merchant class, right? In this circle of control of the military and the money used to pay for it. Now, because of that, the colonial state, and I think that we see this in hegemonic, militaristic states everywhere, including the United States, is the irrational and like indefensible characterization of sex workers as being the only criminal class within the act of prostitution, which of course requires two parties. So sailors, merchants, military men, and of course, the members of the colonial state are thought of as victims of professional prostitutes' seduction techniques, essentially. Now, of course, Segilola capitalizes on that by framing herself as this powerful seductress. But that characterization is used against women broadly and sex workers specifically to justify having to control their uncontainable sexuality and the threat that it poses to the important military and merchant men of wherever. So, sex work is treated like a treat for men, especially white men, and as like an existential threat to the state in women. So these women are pathologized and chased and hated and hunted, whereas their male clients, it's sort of treated as like no big deal, which of course is the cognitive dissonance will hurt you if you think about it too much, but it's sort of a strange disconnect. And one of the places that we'll get into in the next episode where the elite women differ from the colonialists in their characterization of like what the scourge of prostitution is. Of course, they reframe as, we've seen quote unquote feminists do for many generations now. They frame prostitutes as victims of male violence and exploitation rather than thinking of them as active agents, whereas the colonizers sort of go the other way and talk about prostitutes as being like not just active agents, but like villainous, conniving manipulators of otherwise decent men who were like just trying to do their job of like killing and selling on behalf of the state. So Segilola publishes her autobiographical novel first serially in a very popular newspaper, and then as a book form, which then gets translated into English in 1929 and 1930. In 1932, we start to see a censoring effort, right? So the colonizers are smart enough to know that they can't actually outlaw like people mixing things or people taking herbs that grow in the ground, although we did that with marijuana for a long time. They are able to control one's ability to advertise. Now, anyone suffering the effects of cesta fosta knows what a devastating impact on one's livelihood the inability to advertise your goods and services can have. In 1941, which is what we'll get into in the next episode, is when we see a real crackdown on prostitution by the colonial state. This is a massive shift from sort of the military, the official military position of like tolerating the oldest profession and needing to make like, African bodies available to the colonial military into a prohibition. And that is all wrapped up in, the win the war efforts of World War II, the weaponization of the local elite Lagosian women's prohibition efforts, and the dangerous conflation of what these women are asking for and what they actually got. So for more on that, stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you for listening to The Oldest Profession. Thank you to our patrons. Y'all are the best. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you, as always, to our brilliant producer, Justine McClellan. Consider checking out our Instagram, at Old Pro Podcast, to see tons of images of the old pros we talk about on the show. Go to Twitter, also at Old Pro Podcast, for the latest in sex worker events, activism opportunities, and of course, snarky commentary on the news of the day impacting sex workers. Please rate and review us on iTunes. It's a small thing, but it helps a lot. It helps people find us because algorithms. If you're considering coming out as a sex worker to somebody in your life, try suggesting that they listen to the podcast. How they react to this is a pretty good litmus test as to whether or not they'll try to shame you for being an old pro. All of the growth of this podcast so far has been the result of word of mouth. So please keep telling your friends. If everyone tells just one person, we can double our numbers and reach even more old pros and allies. The more listeners we have, the more we can chip away at this stubborn stigma. And again, thank you so much for listening. This has been The Oldest Profession.